Our next storyteller is Daniel Hernandez. He was there at the shooting that day, and he'll talk to you about how that changed his life and exactly how he was involved. But now we're excited to have him from the state capitol here in Arizona.
Thank you so much, Megan, for putting this together. I know that as we approach the 10th anniversary tomorrow, it brings up a lot of complex feelings for many of us. So being able to hear from Gabby, from Emma, Mary, and all of the other survivors that are talking today, I think is a really cathartic thing. So I really want to thank you and the entire team at Storytellers for putting this together. So my name is Daniel Hernandez, and I'm the son of a construction worker and a Mexican immigrant. I grew up poor, gay, and Latino in South Tucson. From a young age, I was taught a really simple lesson by my grandmother, which was pon tu granito de arena, or in English, simply to put in your grain of sand. This idea that we all had something to contribute to make our community a better place. We were taught to be selfless and to help others, even though oftentimes we had little, but we had to be self reliant. So a lot of the time, I never asked for help or felt like I needed it because it could be perceived as a sign of weakness or misconstrued as me not being able to do something. I've always been tough on myself because I've had to work 5 times harder to get half as far as many of my peers. So when I was 17 and I was diagnosed with Graves' disease, it took a while for me to get the diagnosis because at the time our family was struggling and I didn't have access to healthcare. I got kicked off of the children's health care program here in Arizona, Mercy Care, because there had been a paperwork error. But in the meantime of not having access to healthcare, I lost half my body weight. I was having heart palpitations. My kidneys were shutting down. Once it finally got figured out and I finally got insurance and treatment, I wanted to return back to school and just go back to being a normal student, someone who'd been a high performer, someone who'd been in honors classes for years. But my principal, when I sat down with him, instead suggested that I drop out of school, move on with my life, and get a GED. He didn't want to do all the paperwork, and he didn't really care too much about talking about what my plans were. He wanted to do what was easy for him. So I wanted to prove to him and to others that I could do it. So I went back to school and doubled down again, nearly killing myself yet again, but in a different way. I took AP classes, classes at night, classes at the community college, classes on weekends, because I had essentially missed an entire year of school. And I was finally able to get back up to speed, graduating the top 25% of my class. I showed him and everyone else that I was self-reliant, that I was independent, and that I was capable. But in 2008, I had a big change in my life. My family wasn't political at all. In 2008, my father hadn't voted in almost 20 years, and my mother hadn't even become a citizen until 2016. So when I said I wanted to get involved on a campaign because I wanted to elect the first woman president with Hillary Clinton's campaign, they both kind of looked at me like I was a weirdo, because I was. And I signed up, I started volunteering, and I really enjoyed it. And then when the first campaign that I ever worked on lost in June of 2008, I thought I'd never work on a campaign ever again. But that's when I met Gabby, and I started volunteering for her congressional campaign. Eventually, years later, after a very tough reelection in 2010, I said, I need an intern in her congressional office. She'd been asking me for years when I was going to do it. And after she barely won by about 1,500 votes, I said, if not now, when? So I signed up. And on the first day of my internship, I had a really interesting experience where the very first call was an angry constituent calling and cursing and yelling about something that Gabby had done that was terrible. So while I was listening to this person and getting berated, Gabe Zimmerman, who was the director of community outreach, a social worker, came into the office to try and help me. We jokingly called him the constituent whisperer because of his background and his ability to talk anybody off the ledge. He took me aside afterwards and told me that I needed to set boundaries, but that we can always be kind and caring to other people. He was a great role model. And just like everybody else that Gabby surrounded herself with, he was thoughtful and kind and caring. He asked me if I'd be willing to come in on Saturday. And even though I had been working 5 days at that point, he asked me if I could come in and intern and volunteer at an event that Gabby was doing on January 8th of 2011. That was a day that changed my life and countless others, including Gabby and the 12 others that were shot in front of a Safeway back in 2011. It was the worst day of my life, and I saw things that nobody should ever see. For me, 5 days into my congressional internship, it meant that 6 people lost their lives. It meant that my boss, my hero, someone that I looked up to, the first person to ever ask me why I wanted to be a nurse or a doctor, had been injured. And there I was sitting, holding her head, talking to her, trying to keep her calm while she was bleeding. With my head not put on straight trying to figure out what I could do, trying to see what I could do to help Gabby. It took an agonizing 9 minutes before the EMTs were able to come in and take over. Everything that was happening was so traumatic. And for me at the time, I never got to experience or process the same way that everybody else did. When everybody else got to go home and be with their loved ones and think about what had happened, I instead was doing media interviews within hours of the shooting. Within 2 weeks, we'd done over 250 interviews. I never really went through the stages of grief, and for a long time, I thought I could just skip ahead. But the reality is, you can't skip ahead. The grief and the trauma will eventually catch up with you. While I'd always thought I had to be tough and self reliant and that I had to not ask anybody for things because it meant that I was weak, this tragedy really taught me that I need to lean on others. It brought to my attention this idea of something called family. So there were people who helped me who weren't really my family. They weren't related by blood, but they were my chosen family. So whether it was some of my friends doing what they could to make sure that I got to places on time, because right after the shooting, I didn't have my cell phone, I didn't have my car, and was relying on everybody to get around. Or a couple months later, after speaking at a couple of things and things started getting a little crazy, and when my head got too big, somebody was always there to bloop me and tell me that I wasn't that important. It was also sometimes people sitting with me and having a movie where we could just sit and have a good laugh or a cry. I knew that I had a good support system that I could rely on, but it took this tragedy to understand that showing emotion and asking for what I needed wasn't a weakness. Without them and their support, I wouldn't be here where I am today in my growth 10 years later. So for me, realizing this and accepting that I need help sometimes and that it is okay not just to be selfless, but to be able to take the help from others was important. Gabby inspired me and has inspired me every day since the shooting. 6 months after the tragedy in 2011, I entered public life by running for the school board. I learned that for me, taking the trauma to be able to become an advocate and to help change and improve my community was important. But I also learned that you don't operate in a vacuum. The shooting has shown me that we need each other and that we all need to work together to affect change. So whether you're somebody who is like a mother, like Christina Taylor Greene's mom, Roxana Green, who started a nonprofit to make lives better for kids in Tucson, or someone like Pat Maish, who was a survivor of the shooting and became an activist, we all have our own parts to play. We all have our little granito de arena that we have to be able to contribute to society. But we have to be able to be kind to ourselves. We have to be willing to ask and to take help. We have to realize that there is a special strength in not trying to go it alone. And that's why I love the Tucson community, because I know that together we can thrive, and that the people who were involved on January the 8th and the people that were involved in this shooting were able to take their trauma and turn it into action. So I want to thank everybody today for joining us. It's a really tough time with the 10th anniversary tomorrow, but it's so important that we all learn that we can all lean on each other and that we're better when we're all working together for the strength of our community. Thank you, Megan.
Daniel, thank you so much for your thoughtfulness, for your story, for your message. We so appreciate you making time and sharing your heart with us.